Lecture in our series celebrating the centenary anniversary of Le Corbusier. This series has covered the beginnings of Corbu, his influence from nature, his early houses at La Chaux-de-Fonds, and the Champ de Gare. We looked at Champ de Gare with some personal memories of Mohan Sharma. And then Dr. Baker started on Monday with the beginnings of the development of Le Corbusier's cubistic architecture, the influence of his purism painting movement that he founded with Aux Enfants, and went on to discuss the great houses of the 20s, and the Wednesday night lecture covered the great chapel at Ronchamp and La Tourette monastery. Today, Dr. Baker will be talking about the two Jaoul houses near the Bois de Boulogne in Paris. It gives me pleasure to introduce Dr. Baker.
Thank you. Well, we can start with the first two slides, please. As we're looking again at these two buildings that I was talking about on Wednesday night, the chapel at Ronchamp and the monastery of La Tourette, I'm beginning by saying that in 1950, of course, Corbu was 63 years old, and he had 15 more years at that point in time in which to accomplish his life's work. And during the decade that followed, that decade of 1950, he built some of his most significant works, including what we see here, and the government complex at Chandigarh, the Villa Chaudin, the Sarabai House, and he continued to work on the Unité d'Habitation at Marseille. And these works, of course, represent the most sculpturally powerful period in Corbu's output, and in them he uses in the main reinforced concrete, and he exploits the plasticity of concrete. He exploits its texture, its capacity to mold shapes. So this is quite a remarkable surge of Corbu's creative force, in which his handling of light and space and form take on a new meaning when compared to the earlier work that we saw earlier in this week. And of course the Jaoul houses form part of this body of work, the last phase of his life. And the Jaoul houses are situated in what is a very fashionable area, the Neuilly area of Paris, close to the Bois de Boulogne. And when I first saw them, I was very struck by the sense of compact power that is evident in them. And I guess the term pocket battleships came into my mind. They're two very compact, powerful sculptural buildings. One is aware of the sense that these buildings look rather too tough to be trifled with. And they were completed in 1957, and they were Corbu's first statement of his position with regard to the individual dwelling during the post-war years. They shocked his followers at the time. I remember well how shocking they seemed, because as the leader of the international style, he was still associated then with the white buildings of the 20s, and the primitive style of the Jaoul houses with this rough concrete, and the brickwork too is quite rough, and the use of timber and so on. This seemed to be at variance, totally at variance with the kind of technological adulation that was celebrated, of course, in Verine Architecture and in all the pre-war building. So why was Corbu placing such a distance between himself and the inspiration provided by the shining motor cars, the aircraft, which seemed to embody the spirit of the age as he'd seen it previously, the virtues that he was formerly proclaiming and on which he was basing his work? Well, it has a lot to do, I think, with what happened to him during the years that followed the 1930s and what happened to his buildings. Because we find that by the end of the 20s, changes had happened to his work anyway. The purist paintings were no longer relying exclusively on the objet type, on the industrial artifacts and so on. They were now introducing not only a looser, rather more fluid composition, but elements of the human figure and animals and so on, bones and shells and so on, which all bring us back to an earlier position where he was so much dominated in his earlier life and work by nature. One senses this reversion to nature in the choice of the retention of a stone wall in his own apartment, and there we see the studio. The pilotis to the pavillon Suisse were shaped like bones, and we find this mood being expressed for the first time in the weekend house in a Paris suburb in 1935. Here already a rejection of the idea of the hovering slab, the pilotis, the ribbon window and so on. Here we have grass on the roof. We have the use of natural materials, although there are glass bricks as well. He did build, of course, a series of primitive buildings during the 30s. In addition to these, he built houses in North Africa, and these were built of timber as well, and stone. And there were problems too. We have on the one hand this shift towards nature, a shift of interest, and then we have the problems associated with the buildings, so that with the Cité de Refuge, the Salvation Army building, the amount of glass on this facade, which was initially just a glazed facade, and it was intended that air conditioning should cool it. It didn't work satisfactorily, and the brise soleil had to be added to it later. This is not to Corbu's design, and it rather ruins the concept. But the facts were that these earlier buildings had got too much glazing. His own apartment suffered in the same way, and Ozonfont's apartment and studio had the roof lights removed. That was to do with the kind of problems, the technical problems of construction that he was also encountering, problems of insulation in these houses. I visited several of them in Paris, and there was twisting of the window mullions, and the Plenex house there suffered very badly from insulation. When one went inside and talked to the owner there, as I did a few years ago, he was telling me that he'd had to put another wall on the inside with insulation and replace, he was in the process of replacing the windows. It's interesting to see that very briefly, because it's an interesting house with the projecting staircase, and there's a bridge that comes out at the back, a typical Corbusian project on a very compact site done in the 1920s, at the height of that particular period with the usual artist studios. It's a very interesting plan, very interesting three-dimensionally. It's a very clever building. His own apartment too, with its roof terrace, was also suffering when he returned to it after the war. So a change of strategy was needed on purely practical grounds. And in all his post-war buildings, he uses materials in a different way. Certainly on the unités, there the brise soleil dominates, and his love of concrete changes now in the work we're going to see to tremendous interest in its textural possibilities. And there we see Chandigarh and the unité with the tremendous play made by the brise soleil in terms of three-dimensional patterns and so on. Well, that's the background, and one, I suppose, has to remember too, when we talk about texture, that these very first houses of Corbu's were full of pattern and texture. They were similarly compact. They were similarly pocket battleships in the way that the Maison Stotzer is that we see here. And I'm reminded of the Maison Stotzer when I look at the Jaoul houses in many ways. It's as robust as they are, and it's a very strong statement. And it did, in fact, have a concrete floor in it with those concrete projecting pieces that are holding up the balcony. Now, the Jaoul houses were originally to be built on a square-shaped plot, not the present one that we see here, which is rectilinear. It was originally square-shaped. And on this Rue de Ronchamp, we go on down here and we finish up at the Bois de Boulogne. Very select residential area with a Spanish-style villa on this side, right next door to the building. So it's a centroidal site initially. The path of the sun going around like this: morning sun, afternoon sun. A section with a fall down to the road from that side to here, and some views towards gardens. I suppose a similar site in some ways to the La Roche-Jeanneret houses that we saw on Wednesday. Now, in a sketch design that was dated September 1951, we see on the far side this original idea for a couple of rectangles placed alongside each other in a relationship that seems as if it might just shift along, but it's pinned down at the center. Each house is contained in a separate volume. We've got the two houses here, and first of all I should say that the intention of the brief, the requirement of the brief, was to provide two houses for two families, the Jaoul parents and the Jaoul son and his children, the elder parents, and then they were to live in one house, and the son and his children to live in the other. It was to provide straightforward family accommodation with garages and guest rooms, living areas, kitchen, and so on. No very firm requirements as I understand it. But what we find in this very first design, it's quite significant really, we see the beginnings of the vaulted system. It's not apparent in the drawings, but we have the spine wall down the middle. We have what is basically a 1.5 to 1 volumetric subdivision in both houses. We have in this case the main floor plans at different levels on this plan, taking advantage of the fall in the site. I've simply put them on for convenience here to show how the main floor plan was organized. And we have an entry point here, and you can see the houses are more or less locked together. There's an extended terrace here, and we have the garage level to house B at the same level as the living level to house A. However, there's the kitchen, there's the living area extending round that corner with a dining area on that side and a staircase punctuating this long rectilinear form. And on the opposite side, we just have a variant on that with a dining area, a living area, and a kitchen. And in embryo, we have really got the essence of the two houses stated here to begin with, although that changes a good deal. That's just a diagram of the sense of shifting relationships and the idea of pinning them together evident in that design. Well, in December 1951, we have a greatly simplified version of this scheme, but with the same 1.5 to 1 space division, but now with the separate dwellings joined by a central area of access to both houses. And instead of the piers that in fact were evident in the earlier scheme, we've got, if we just look back at that, we had piers supporting the beams that would hold up presumably the vaults in that case. We now have a continuous wall evident. This is much closer to the final scheme, and we have a ramp down to the garage and up to the houses coming in this direction. We have on this drawing here, the side view shows the vaults, and here we see how the two houses come together, and we can see these long edge beams that will be supporting the vaults at the sides. The stairs the stairs are now defining an entrance vestibule as we come into this house here, from the entry situation, this access area. We come in here, and then we come along into a volume separated in the middle by a fireplace, with a living area and a kitchen and a dining area here. There's the staircase. And similarly in this house, we go round the WC. In each case, that's a close, the typical Corbusier WC. We go round that, past the staircase, and then we go into a living, dining, kitchen situation with this extra space in each case as perhaps a study or just a small reading area. There again we see the overall appearance of this. And this is the ramp leading up to this area with some steps down. There was obviously a problem with this square-shaped site. Either the land became unavailable or they couldn't afford it, because the next scheme we see is on a rectilinear site. Here's the road, and it's compressed now onto this rectangle, and because of the compression, he tries out this oblique system. But again, we have the linkage in the middle. Both houses are always tied together in these earlier schemes, and we have an uneasy situation now. The way this sits on the site is really rather uncomfortable. It's bold, it's dramatic, it's a typical Corbusian piece of sculpture, but we have an additional unit here. But you see, he has departed quite considerably, in essence, from what we've been looking at, and that scheme was not followed through. Instead, the next scheme we see is this one here, where we've got the rectilinear plot, we've got the access zone now here, we've got that arrangement we saw in the earlier drawing, we've seen it just one back, and we're coming in again past this cloaks, past the staircase. There we still have pretty well that original plan form, but they're at right angles to each other now and compacted to produce this particular arrangement, still the 1.5 to 1 basic subdivision of vaulting and so on. We've now got obviously a ramp leading down to a garage, up staircase onto this zone here. And the only really important thing that happens to that is, the major thing is that it's handed in the final solution. Instead of coming up this way, we come up on this side. Well, several things are apparent from the series of sketches. The site and the houses grow smaller. This is much smaller than those original drawings we saw. Maybe they were, the earlier schemes were too expensive. But we do see Corbu retaining some basic ideas, one of which is to relate the houses about a central zone, into which he locks them like pieces in a jigsaw puzzle. And secondly, he uses an articulation system common to both houses, which allows at the same time a separate identity for each. They're not identical houses, and yet he manages to keep them unified by the same articulation system. Thirdly, we've got this same 1.5 to 1 space disposition, and the main room alignment was fixed at an early stage. But we shall see how he exploits this arrangement, into which he was obviously forced in the final resolution to the problem. So there we have the site revised. There we have the plot, the views, the main axis. And what he does is to build the garage into this slope so that he establishes a level plateau on the top. And the garage is possible to go down into the garage and up onto the plateau, onto the platform. Now the statement is very much a statement of interlock about this zone here. That's diagrammatically what is happening. There we see the arrangement where the ramp goes down and up onto that zone, and we have a series of zones formed around the house. We've got a garden here, we've got a garden here, we've got the longitudinal axis expressed in this house of the reacting really to the external axis, and then we've got the longitudinal axis of the site in this house. Yeah, I'm going to call this house A, this one house B. for reasons that will become apparent. And there we're looking in this picture at the view inwards. Now, from the earliest stages, it was intended to have this house, a house using barrel vaults, which provide a major symbolic component in the design because they suggest many ideas. They suggest enclosure, protection. There's a sense of repose about this gentle rhythm of the vaults. And it's the handling of these vaults, externally and internally, which determines the articulation system and gives Corbu his opportunity here to do something quite different to what we've seen in the cubic architecture of the 20s. Now, given that these vaults exert a thrust obliquely, this is countered in two ways. One, by having these edge beams that we see here, and which come through at the side of the building. And then we have tie bars coming across in all sorts of places, and they are expressed, fastened by a bolt on the outside, covered by this little concrete cylinder. So they're put more or less at various places where they're needed. They don't occur regularly. These little cylinders occur at various points, and they bind the structure together. The beams give a pronounced horizontality to the form, and they express this sandwich-like stratification, with the vaults being contained within the slab. And the curvature of the vaults is contained within the slab. We'll see that in a moment, but what I want to show you here is the way the blocks are related and controlled by the spine wall onto which the vaults rest in the 1.5 to 1 relationship of the two spaces, but also the basic relationship of the two blocks, which is absolutely central to the design theme. Now, when we look at these vaults, the first point to make is that the vaults occur within the slab. So basically we've got these three slabs and the vaults actually occurring within them. They're only expressed externally at the top. They're not expressed at the two lower, well, at this level, which is where the vaulting occurs, but they do occur here, and they occur in conjunction, of course, with the curve of the roof. The roof is curved because it contains soil, and for drainage purposes, the grass and so on, that is curved over to allow drainage. So there we have this tremendous contrast between that part of the slab and this part. In essence, we might think of the thing as generically a static cubic volume, which becomes stratified in these horizontal layers, and then becomes curved at the top for reasons of which I've just described, and then becomes like this, with its curve and the other two curves all interacting. And then on top of the form, we have additions as well. We can't see it too well there. There's a little addition on each building, and they too have, of course, their vaults expressed. So this adds the vitality to the configuration. So the main theme then is as we look at the interior to house A and we look at the exterior of house B, the main theme is embodied in this structurally symbolic deployment of vaulting, which has the opposed forces of thrust and counter-thrust, the vaults representing shelter, providing an intensely private domain, so that we have structural forces resolved in a state of equilibrium, conveying, I think, perhaps a sense of peace in a hostile world. So we typically find Le Corbusier exploiting a situation quite dramatically and reversing, on this occasion, his position during the 20s when the domino structural principle led him towards the Villa Savoie and the other buildings, as we've seen in the 5 points. All the ideas were abandoned here, the roof terrace, the 5 points, and so on, in what we now see. Instead of being a machine for living in, instead of being a crisp building, we now have rather primitive, rough imagery. We have a womb-like protective enclosure for family life. Instead of these very sharp planes, as in the La Roche house, we have solid load-bearing construction, masonry construction holding up a vault. Very much back to the kind of houses he'd seen in the Eastern Mediterranean during the tour of 1911. In terms of symbolic imagery, of course, the nautical imagery is gone, and we're back to something very much more simple. This is a drawing that Corbusier did explaining the vaults. And all this high-tech has gone and is replaced by the most intricate, far more mysterious spaces wandering around, being separated by these slab-like forms, which of course we did have slabs in this building, but they were used in a different way. The essential theme really is explained here. The basic statement of the design is to have load-bearing masonry, stratified slabs, and we find that the construction is 11-inch cavity brickwork, and there are tiles underneath the vaults. We've got these 1-inch solid steel tie rods, generally at 15 feet centres, but as I've said, they're deployed all over the place. We've got the grass on the roof to resist thermal expansion and to improve insulation. And we've got panels of timber and glass placed between the brick panels. So these are load-bearing brick panels, and then we've got panels of timber and glass. We've got services in ducts under the floor at the sides here of the, you can see the ducts there, just where the vaults meet on the edge beam, and the brick walls are plastered internally. Now, what we find, as we have done throughout these analyses of this building, is that the idea of linkage is central. When I first did this analysis, I wasn't aware of the drawings in the Fondation that I showed you earlier. But my conclusions were that there was this possibility of linkage between the two forms here, and that this is fairly evident. I was reassured and pleased by the confirmation of that in the earlier designs, because all the designs, as we saw, worked on the notion of linkage. What we find, though, is that this form, House A, is actually attached to this building. It's right onto it, and it seems to operate in an anchorage role, with this building, House B, being linked to it by inference. We have a solid end to this wall, this building, and we have panels at the ends of this building, part glazing, part timber. There we see the panels, here we see the solid. So we have a feeling that the linearity here is increased, and the sense of connection, potential connection is increased to here, whereas this is very much rooted to the ground. And this is the house occupied by the parents. Seems to have a sheltering role. The geometry links them as well, because the spine walls work geometrically like this. They come down, that spine wall comes down, and it forms the point at which the staircase in House A is located. And then we have the staircase in House B located at the edge of the garage, again onto the spine wall. So we have equal dimensions, as I'm showing on here, equal dimensions. And equal dimensions too on these blocks above. So we have this particular geometry, again, linking the houses together. Then when we look at House A, it does have primacy. One is always looking at Corbusier's work in terms of the primary and the secondary, the front and the back, and so on, the hierarchical situation. And here we have primacy, and it's achieved by a pile-up, a pyramidal pile-up, which goes to a point in the center in a way that that doesn't quite match. And then we have the addition on this one of these projecting rainwater pipe heads. The rainwater pipes are housed in here, and then the rainwater pipes go down internally. But he exaggerates the positioning of them on this house and doesn't actually express them at all on that house. We have a sense of pressure, I think, coming down on us as we move through this rather confined space into the access zone, the entry zone. I did have a plan of a rainwater pipe on an earlier drawing. I got rid of it because it was too much on the drawing. But on that particular one, I hadn't erased it. And so we corrected that later. But, I was looking at the plans with some interest. And there we see these rainwater heads. And they come out cubically and do quite a job. We've got a bathroom stuck on there, you see, in addition to this extra room at the top. And that has a little cubic bathroom. So there is a terrific build-up of the form. Now, the theme of these houses, it's worth going through, I think, the various things that are happening here, because a number of things are happening. The interdependent relationship between the two families, in my opinion, forms the basis of the Jaoul house's theme. And it receives expression through the arrangement in which House A assumes primacy with this protective role. So we've got the other house, secondary but more dynamic, linked by the way they both lodge into this access zone by what I've already described. So we've got these various points that can be made, demonstrating the theme. We've got the vaulted structure, thrust and crack counter-thrust. We've got the support role of the load-bearing walls. We've got the importance of the end and corner treatment in each house that we'll refer to in a moment. And if we think back to earlier houses by Corbu, we can think of the parents' house and the house at the Lochler as both having their corners very carefully treated. We have the horizontality, the oblique thrust, and the 1.5 to 1 rhythm of the vaults themselves. We have the exertion of directional pressure from House A towards the entry zone, the intensification of the linearity of House B, the location of entry, a particular strategy towards the external membrane treatment, which we shall see in a moment, including the fenestration. And then we have the up and down oblique contrast of the entry ramps. So in addition to all these things, we have an additional dynamic with the arrangement of the entry ramps. But let's look at some of this in a little more detail. If we look at entry to each house is located in the access zone here, and it is on the linear axis in each case. A little canopy comes out and just defines the point of entry in the simplest possible way. And that is again characteristic of Corbu, as I've mentioned earlier, that he didn't attach undue importance to entry on all occasions. He just let it happen in a natural way. He didn't actually celebrate it particularly. And then we have the entry point on House B. Now, the basic statement of the houses here is shown very clearly in House B by the way the slab is allowed to be stated very clearly. It's helped by the presence of a WC, a cylinder, which penetrates underneath the slab so that we have space coming underneath there. We have a very strong sense of membrane at the ends of House B in the way that we have what is in fact a structurally composed panel, series of panels of glass and timber, but it is based on a solid structure. I mean, it has thickness, it has shelving inside it. And that's really quite important because it's carrying on the theme whereby we have panels. We have brick panels at the sides and we have timber panels at the ends, at any rate on House B. In House A, we didn't have that in fact. On House A, we had, and if we'll just go back a moment, see the solidity of this, the sense of panels, the sense of penetration. But let's just go back a moment and look at the treatment of House A. Because House A has brick panels at the ends. I've already mentioned to you that it has this solidity at its sides, and we've seen that that's the role of anchorage that is being maintained. But what is interesting is the fact that the panels do not connect at the corners. We have the slab continuing, and we have a break between panel, and that break is expressed by a corner treatment in this way. Well, consistency, you see, dictated that the same thing happens here, that we have, again, a discontinuity of the panel, and this time we then put a timber and glass panel across the end. That's a rainwater pipe. That's just the cantilevered entry porch. We may as well look at the plan here, just showing how entry is organized, very much like we've seen in those earlier studies, where we come into a vestibule, but this time the WC being at the side doesn't interfere with the progression, not in this house. We have the definition of the interior by the staircase. That's defining the long space. We've got the kitchen as originally to the side with the dining adjacent. And then we go on to the living area and the study at the side there with the fireplace at the end. This was done in accordance with the modular. The modular was used to determine the disposition of these elements, and of course we have a rich three-dimensionality and organisation of glazing, which is in its way similar to what we saw in the chapel at Ronchamp. The south wall of the chapel at Ronchamp has a similar distribution of large and small openings, done for different reasons in a different way, but nevertheless there seems to be some connection there. We also find that the way this end panel is aligned is observing at the corners the linearity of the mass. It's not an equal situation here. It's longer this way than that way. So we're observing the linearity. That's just a view of the WC. Now, the whole idea of fenestration, of course, is transformed by the constructional system used here when we compare it to the earlier houses. We've got a tremendous variety of windows possible now with this arrangement, because the load-bearing brickwork has these horizontal beams. It means that he was quite free to dispose windows anywhere he wanted to. I mean, the windows themselves are not load-bearing, the panels are. What he does do, of course, is to emphasize the notion of load-bearing panel by the deep recesses of the window panels, so that sometimes we have a large one, sometimes we have a small one, sometimes we have a very small one. But the notion is very clearly that of emphasizing the nature of load-bearing panel. And here you can see the roughness of the brickwork and of the concrete. The concrete organized in a pattern, as we can see. So there's a tremendous variety, but that variety is based on internal needs now. With the ribbon window, he was not free to distribute light internally as he wanted to, but now he is, and the lighting internally is of a very different order to anything that he did in the 1920s. And environmentally, the Jaoul houses are far more successful than the purist designs. This is the chapel, the private chapel in the house, inside and outside. And it's the only occasion where the window comes out flush and is not timber, it's in concrete. All the others are timber panels. And there you see it's more or less flush. And the whole idea of the panel is replaced on this occasion for special purposes. So that is to illustrate the point about the ribbon window and the difference it makes now to be able to distribute light in accordance with particular requirements. When it comes to a matter of a thing like a balcony, it's interesting again the way that this is treated. On House A, we have the balcony projecting out, and as the linear axis runs that way, this is propped up by a post. On House B, it's cantilevered out along the line of the vault without any post underneath it. But what we do notice, of course, is that so as not to interfere with the main form and the mass, we only have wire mesh and a railing between house and balcony, so that we have the concrete form coming out, not in any way interfering with this statement, and yet complementing it. And similarly here, we have the wire mesh and the balcony at the side. Now what these two balconies are doing, of course, is to receive the sun. They're both at points where they are able to both have views, such as they are, looking out, and also the sun coming around in this way. They receive the sun morning and in the afternoon. And of course this garden here, House B's garden, receives afternoon sun quite pleasantly along here. The way the zones are defined, as in all his work, is interesting and done in accordance with the general principles of this design. We have a reinforced concrete slim wall along here, a very slender wall. You can't quite see it there because it's been overgrown. This was the very first visit I made to the Jaoul houses in 1966. I've subsequently made another couple of visits, and we have the wire mesh here, the definition of this zone here along the entry ramp, and then we have this again very, very thin slab with its little sloping top, and that concludes here, and then is supplanted by this other slab across here. And we have a very careful treatment of the steps as we rise up onto this level, with the horizontal slab again of the seat that's going along there. And there's the quite elaborate treatment of this corner. We can't see it on this side, we'll see it in a moment, where we've got a connection between the concrete forms, and there's the other slab. And there's this rather neat corner treatment that I've already alluded to. Now, when we go through the movement sequence, in fact, we'll see that view that I was just describing to you, because as with all his work, the movement sequence is very carefully considered. First of all, we have this rather mysterious view of a very strange-looking house, very unconventional-looking house, and we have to make our discoveries as we move towards it, approaching on the ramp, and then coming on to this special zone here where we move into the two houses. And if we just take ourselves along that route, looking to the right, I think, at this mound that has been formed, a rather nice treatment of the garden, presumably of excavated earth around here from the site, so that again we see this patterning on the concrete and this very crisp treatment. And of course it's interesting too, the way the two houses are aligned, that we get the vaults operating against each other in the most interesting way. I mean, there they are looking at us this way, and there they are that way, so that the juxtaposition here and the sense of something important happening up here is increased. There we have that little rail connecting the two blocks. We're getting more information now about this, and there we're looking back into the garden. There we have this rather important access zone with its square paving slabs, establishing a platform from which the houses can be viewed, giving a sense not just of arrival, but a sense of the presence, the importance of the two houses. And then when we come to House A, the interior, this is interesting three-dimensionally. We come in to a very tight space indeed with one of these vertical load-bearing panels preventing us seeing in properly. And then we move around the corner, the curved corner of the WC there, onto the long axis. And once we're on the long axis, we're in this space which is actually vaulted at the lower level for this part of it, and then it rises at the end. This is all low vaulting at this side, the smaller vault, the larger vault, and then at the end we have the larger, higher vault with top light coming in from the side. He puts a large window on this side, so we're drawn by light towards the end wall. And as we move along, we find ourselves not just drawn by the light, but the fact that the space is continuing round the corner. This is something we saw at La Tourette, that when space is continuing in a particular direction, he organizes things like the fireplace to point in that direction, as he did with the altar at La Tourette. So we find a real sense of the oblique here, as we have a sense of the full, in the way this is sculpted. The fireplace projects out. It also has incisions in it to link the two spaces. It's essentially linking a larger and small space. And it's doing it very cleverly by the distribution of the incisions in the wall on either side. This is a very clever piece of work, as we shall see. So let us come round the corner. There we were. We're just going in that direction. Service pipes exposed. And that makes a nice little punctuation to the space, looking back along the axis, in fact. We're looking back twice here along that axis, because what we're seeing is the punctuation of the staircase. So the staircase is expressed very clearly as a kind of zigzag. You know, the steps themselves make their point. The sideboard too makes its point. The standard design that he used in all his buildings for a long, long time, this particular sliding door panel detail recurs. We might expect it to. He defines the circulation route by these projections out. The way the concrete is formed defines the route. And we saw that at the Villa Savoy. On the ramp, as we moved up the ramp, that was defined in the same way. We have the cream floor tiles, and we have just this central piece of parquet flooring for the dining area, because as we move along here, we then have a glimpse through this opening into that far space round the corner that we saw. Now, here we see it from the other direction, looking through that way, and then the way this fireplace is treated, as I said, with a tremendous sense both of the oblique and of going this way, with this very interesting deployment of the beam resting on that, and then that great incision there, and the whole ensemble taking the scale down, exactly as he did at La Tourette. And the way we were focusing on the monks' cells, those cells at the entry, it's very similar that our eye focuses on this as we move along the axis, just as our eye focuses on the brightness of this end wall with its window to the right. The color polychromatic principles, the use of these particular colors is in accordance with what he called on the La Roche-Jeanneret houses architectural camouflage, where he used color to influence the mood, sometimes livening up a dark area and sometimes cooling down a bright area. I won't go into the principles themselves, that's another story, but I can assure you that there are rules that are observed for these colors. And there we have the final point in this movement sequence with that fireplace we've just been looking at to the right. The way these windows are formed as three-dimensional solids with their bookshelves as part of them, and looking out into the garden between the two houses. Now, if we look at House B, we've got a different situation. We're coming in at this entry door with the same trick. What we're actually doing is to move along that axis with the definition of the staircase, and on the drawing I've shown here, we've got the vertical plane emphasized between the two legs of the staircase, the dog-leg staircase. We've got a vertical plane thrusting down, and indeed we had that in the last house as well. We have the two vaults now of the same height, just running all the way along. We don't have any vertical space as such. And this house, as I said, was more linear anyway. You remember I said that house A was not so linear, and it was anchored onto the sidewall. Well, this is a linear house with open ends to it, in a sense. The movement route comes along here, and then is distributed this time by the fireplace. Similarly, we have the shelves of the signboard projecting towards the axis of movement. But whereas the fireplace on the other house was locked at the end and terminated a vista, in this case the vista continues past it, over it, so that we can see over this fireplace, beyond, through window, right through, so that the axis of movement is maintained. That's a significant change, as is the fact that the staircase now is sculpted again to link the space here by this pulling out of the corner, so that we have the oblique emphasized, and that's just the space for log. There's the actual fireplace, and there's the chimney flue. That chimney flue position so that we can see past it. We have a symbolic marble top table, again on the linear axis, just celebrating the idea of eating, and there's the zigzag. So here are all the contrasts of 1.5 to 1 vaulting, horizontality, vertical punctuation, sculptural definition provided to separate two spaces and to separate movement. We go that way into the study and this way into the living area, the intimate area, and there we just have these interconnections as we had in the other house with a little slab joining. So if we just take ourselves along that route, here we can see the projection out of a table, part of the sculptural ensemble, which greets us at the staircase. There it is. And that's the vista. That's the vista that we look along now, into the distance, past the chimney flue, straight through into the garden beyond. There's the breakfast bar. There's the way the fireplace is beginning to allow us to move to either side. And there's the way that fireplace is actually formed, with a table again signifying, I believe, study. This is a study area. It has shelves in it. That's been changed subsequently, actually. There's more shelves in now than there were. But there we have the two spaces. There we have the general arrangement of the pivot door here, giving access to the garden, and the window allowing the axis of movement to continue, as I described. Here we have some sketches done by Corbusier that I discovered in the Fondation. I don't think they're actually drawn by him, actually. I think not. I think these are drawn by somebody else. They're rather more carefully drawn than I would expect him to do. He did very rough sketches. These look as if they're those sketches we do to see what it's going to look like. And there we see pretty well what's happening in House B, don't we, with that fireplace, the marble top table, the sideboard, and so on. We don't see the staircase drawn in. There we see that study area, but with the table not locked onto the fireplace as it now is. That table is now locked onto the other side, as we've seen there. Now we're looking at this fireplace. And that's a view in the other house, I believe. Or is it? I'm trying. No, I think this is the same. Yes, it's the same house. Sorry, it's the same house with the fireplace. And that's where the marble top table actually is. And that's the view of the kitchen with the breakfast bar here, and the small additional breakfast seating unit, which we shall see in a moment, which is in fact there. There's the table as it is. That's it with shelving added. That's it on a previous visit without shelving there. There was just shelving there in the original design. The vermilion wall. Vermilion to liven up this particular rather dark area. And so it's taking the shelving quite happily. It doesn't seem to bother it. There's some more drawings. That's the entry to House B. And that is a marble table placed in House A. There's the vertical volume of House A, which means that he's transported that table and put it into House B. There it is, you see, in House A, looking along House A towards that vertical volume onto which the light was falling, and there's the fireplace of House A. So that table didn't stay there and went into House B. There we see it in House B. Another view looking across from towards the study, to the side of there, looking from there across in this House B. That's the kitchen that he designed for his parents' house in La Chaux-de-Fonds in 1912. And that was meant to go on at just the same time, actually, because that's the kitchen to the Jaoul houses, which is the same basic idea of a long, narrow space with units on one side. Well, some units on each side, in fact. There we have the primary colours of the tiles. This idea, this sense of continuity, of course, very important in Corbusier's work. There we see these typical details. Service pipes all expressed. This was, of course, the pair of houses that spawned the term, the new brutalism, didn't it? And the idea of the raw expression of things, and a whole series of, a whole movement evolved, didn't it, from this, the work of the Smithsons and James Stirling doing his Ham Common houses in this vein, and others, very much influenced by it at the time. The idea of honesty, the idea of integrity was what was appealing, I believe, as well as a sculptural richness, of course. That's a drawing of the fireplace, showing the of the staircase, showing the importance of the zigzag in amongst everything else. In House B, we have a studio. You can see how the vaults actually, well, the vaults stop. You can't see that too well, but there's this central panel that holds up the stairs, and then the vaults stop at either side. There's a gap between the stairs and what occurs at the sides of them anyway. And then we have this studio for the younger Mrs. Jaoul. That's the top part of that house. Painting studio. There's an interesting story that I was told by the younger Monsieur Jaoul, about the floor tiles, because we find these in various places. And according to what he told me, his wife had been talking to Corbu's wife, and Corbu's wife had said that it wasn't really a good idea to have these cream floor tiles. They were difficult to clean. So she said to Corbu, would he mind if she didn't have these tiles? And he said he was sorry, but he did mind, and he really would prefer to have these tiles. So then she said, well, I don't really want these tiles. I don't want these tiles. So he said, Corbu, this is a story I was told by Monsieur Jaoul. He said, well, I won't design the house then. He actually said that. He wouldn't design the house. And he put pressure on the elder Mr. Jaoul to exert pressure on his daughter-in-law to accept the tiles, which she did, and that's the way it was resolved. And what he did, he put these tiles in, and he said, never use spirits of salt to clean these tiles. Attention, do not use spirits of salt to clean these tiles, because apparently that's what his wife did, and that was the reason he reckoned that she found difficulty cleaning them. But anyway, that's a little story, and he has these tiles put into the building. Talking to the people who live in these houses, they are full of admiration for Corbu. They just love him, and they love the houses. They feel, as they told me, surrounded by his presence there, and they keep the houses very private. They don't let anybody into them. I was very fortunate, very privileged to get into them, because not many people have, and they're not on the tour or anything like that. And they just feel they're surrounded by one of the most personal of Corbu's monuments. Well, okay, I've just said a few words here about what I believe of this terrific shift of emphasis from your orthogonal planning. And I believe I said at one stage in the week, I shouldn't have done, that all this planning was orthogonal. Well, of course it isn't here. It's not an orthogonal case at all. We've got away from abstract idealism towards these fundamental questions relating to the family. That's the big shift. I mean, it's back to a certain attitude to nature. And he talks about these rhythms of the day, the 24-hour rhythm of the day, and here we have the rhythms of the vault. So the most pervasive symbol of this period was the roof terrace. Now we've got vaults as the main symbol. And of course, this part of our past, isn't it? We lived in caves, the Romans used them. We've got the soft feminine curves, tunnel-like shelter, ideas of the dwelling as a maternal refuge, a womb-like situation rooted in Mother Earth. So it's a complete reversal. The doctrinaire certainty, demonstrated in an architecture of clear prisms, precise primary forms, is replaced by an acknowledgement of the mystery of the life force, with forms that are not immediately comprehensible, But then I said containing ambiguities and contradictions, and I read about that today, and I thought, well, I've just been using words cleverly because I couldn't think of any. Couldn't think of any ambiguities or contradictions as such, but you might be able to spot them. So I must apologise for that. And we get carried away with words occasionally, don't we? Without realising what we're saying. Here we've got the difference between the skin and the transparency and the solidity. And here we've got, of course, a difference in technique too, as we look into one of the bedrooms. Rather nice the way these windows are related. You get a great feeling of security. And of course, it's the notion of shutters that's present, as it is in a lot of French houses. So it's a back-to-surface texture, very much, I believe, as we saw in that's the Villa Palais, I think. It's the Villa Palais. So we've got back to that kind of sculptural complexity. A different kind of technique altogether. And there we see, looking along the axis, the light falling on this wall at the end. I've seen numerous changes in the arrangement of paintings whilst I've been visiting the houses. Sometimes, I think that they've gone when I was there last. That's the wrong way around, isn't it? Sorry. But what we're sensing very much is that we've got this boldness now, this tremendous fluency in Corbusier's work, whether it's in his paintings or in his architecture, a tremendous feeling of sculptural richness. And if we think back to the houses that he did, one of them for his parents, and of course the one where we saw, we didn't see them, but in the Fabre-Jacot house, the column capitals had doves in the column capitals themselves, sculpted by Leon Perrin. Birds were portrayed in the fireplace, created by Corbusier, the design of the fireplace in his parents' house. Here we have a bird's nesting platform. He's still looking after the birds. They can nest there in that little platform, and there's a little hole for them to go into. And I think there's a real sense here of life in terms of life going on even in the grass up above here.